Welcome to the 10th YARE event. A warm greeting to all our guests, all the companies who trusted us, and all the captains they accept our invitation, and the speakers they join us in this special event, the first digital YARE event. I want to take the opportunity to thank you, our people and organizer, to convert this difficult moment in a great opportunity. As you know, all the event this year has been cancelled. My YARE for sure will be a success. I'm 100% sure on that. And I want to thank you again, all the organizers, for that. As you know, the 2019 was a stable year, and we all were waiting the effect of Brexit and German economy problem to see how it was affecting the yachting industry. But these things remained unsolved because we got a bigger issue, COVID-19. But at the end of the day, for us, for yachting industry, the COVID had a positive effect. The yacht is an island, a good island to isolate yourself. So that became very important for our industry. In fact, all the shipyards are investing in new model, new technology. And I should say that clients are alive and they are pushing designers, shipyards to do new stuff and new technology adventure. This is a very positive for our business, and I think that will be more and more good for all the industry. As you know, YARE is the only international event which is taking care of existing yachts in terms of refit and after-sales services. Our companies and in the industry are dealing with captains, that they are the only reference for end users of the boats and the relationship with owners. And from their feedback, the companies can get more and more knowledge how to improve the industry and how to propose new systems and new technology on the market. What will happen in these 2 days? We will have the Superyacht Captains Forum, the first digital one, led by my friend Martin, who decided to choose YARE as the first event of an international tour where he's going to make a lot of speeches about very challenging events, challenging activities like sustainability, like cybersecurity, and other activities that I'm sure it will be a great job for all Europe. Then we will have 2 prizes, 2 RINA awards, one for the more innovative company and the other one for the best captain, focusing on what is the mission of our event. Then, of course, there will be also some light moment, soft moment, with some music and some view of the beautiful Tuscany. Luckily, we cannot see. But I should say that I want to thank you once more, all the sponsors and all local authorities, and I hope to see you soon in person, to feel you, to see you, that a luckily digital cannot give this. But I'm sure it will be anyway a great event. Thank you so much and have a great job.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome to YARE 10th edition, the Superyacht Captains Forum Live. My name is Martin Redmayne. It's a much easier situation to fly to Viareggio, to check into a hotel, have a dinner the night before and turn up in the morning with a slightly shortened sleep. So I apologize for slight delays. The virtual world is not always our friend, but we're working with it very well from now on. I'm here. Thank you very much for your patience. So listen, we've got a couple of very interesting days ahead of us. We've got some really powerful workshops, great moderators, great speakers, talking about a whole raft of very important topics that captains, managers, and all the various advisory network really need to focus in on. The cybersecurity topic, green issues, paint topics, the refit planning topic, a couple of really interesting sessions linked to owner's experience and the owner journey. And I think there's some very nice entertainment elements this year, which I think will be interesting for those who want to learn about cookery, food, wine, and the world of luxury. So enjoy yourselves the next couple of days. And I hope that this is going to be the start of a new way of working together in a hybrid format. But I promise you, I want to be back in Viareggio next year and with all the people I love and spend time with. And more importantly, we are a very human, tactile, passionate industry. And we can't be apart like this anymore. It's very, very dull, and I miss you all. Okay, so thank you for your attention. I'm going to do a very, very quick presentation now. We're a little bit behind schedule, but I hope this is going to set some interesting scenes and give you some feedback as to what I think is happening in the market, and more importantly, essentially what exactly is happening in the industry today. From my point of view, let's call it that, my point of view. So let me just share my screen with you all. I hope you can all see this fairly clearly. I'm talking about the future, the state of the market, and let's say this is going to be some data, intelligence, projections, and some commentary on what I think we need to focus in on beyond this mad year. Okay, so what I'm going to do is try and show you, sorry, this is the first thing I want to ask the question to myself, but also all the people participating. Is 2020 a wake-up call? And by that I mean, is this a time to sort of reset the dial and rethink about our future? Because obviously it's been a dramatic year. In some ways there's been some positive stuff. There's some really interesting things happening within 2020. But more importantly, it's been a devastating year in terms of the way in which we operate, the way in which we work together, the way in which we travel or use yachts. It's all been fairly disruptive, but I think it's given us a chance to almost reflect on what's been happening to us in terms of the market. I wanted to set the scene first, and this is a key part of what I call the rhetoric going forward. And this rhetoric is very important in terms of the total number of people out there who are worth significant sums of money. And I think this is something we need to focus in on as an industry going forward. So these headline numbers are very, very straightforward. 300,000 people worth $30 million plus. Now, that category is primarily the people I talk about who could charter in the yachting space. You could use a yacht for a week, 2 weeks or more as a vacation and escape. Second tier is the 100 million plus category, which I believe are people who can afford to buy any of the 30 meter plus entry level yachts and beyond. $100 million gives you a lot of leverage, and therefore there's a fairly large percentage of people out there who can easily afford to get into the super yacht space. And the final category is the uber rich, the $500 million plus, and that number is 8,000 people now, and it's growing quite excitingly. So that's one element of this conversation we need to look at for the future. The second tier of the wealth topic is what's going to happen in the next 10 years. And I think that's something we all have to focus in on very carefully. There's some fairly good data coming out now that the various organizations, Bloomberg Wealth, UBS, BNP Paribas, and obviously WealthX, are suggesting that there's going to be 43,000 people who are going to enter that ultra high net worth category in the next 5 years. That's significant growth of wealth. The other interesting dynamic is this transfer of wealth, which we're all talking about between now and 2030. That's due to death, passing on, inheritance, etc. $15 trillion will be passed on to the next generation in the next 10 years. And the majority is in the upper tier, the $500 million plus category and the 100 million plus category, because they're the ones who are in the the final years of their, let's say, wealth and life cycle. So these three factors are fairly important as to how the future of our market looks in terms of development and growth. So let's put those two slides into context. I look at the fleet in several different ways, and I look at with my team and say, okay, what does the future really hold? So I'm going to show you some really interesting data that I'm hoping will give you some interesting references linked back to that wealth data. Fleet dynamics. We look at the fleet post 1990 primarily. I think that's an important factor. We look at the last 30 years because that's really been the most prolific years of super yachting. Probably when I started the market, which is a long time ago for some of the young people in the audience. So pre-1990, we only had a small fleet of 1,260 boats built over probably 100 years or more in many cases. So it's a very slow burning market up to pre-1990. Between pre-1990 up to the end of 2020, we're seeing this fleet getting up to 5,700 yachts. So we've got a fairly significant growth in that 30 years, 4,400 yachts. That's a number that we like to look at as being what I call the modern fleet, the active fleet. And we estimate by 2030 plus, we'll get over the 6,500 barrier, maybe more if things start to sort of shape up in the next 2 to 3 years and things work well with that wealth data we showed you earlier on. So that could be exceeded quite dramatically if we get our act together on targeting the next generation. So look at the 30 years of super yacht activity. You can see some fairly interesting numbers. The growth period between 2000 and 2009 was where the most aggressive growth took place. We all know why. We saw the financial markets and the availability of capital, etc. It was an interesting time. Beyond 2020, 2019, the growth rate is halved, but it's still growing, which is the thing we have to remember. Growth is still there in our marketplace, and it's an interesting future when we look at these numbers in later time. So how we break down this market is very simple. We look at these categories and we put in the growth rates by 30 to 40, 40 to 60, 60, 90, 90 plus. There are 4 market categories we look at very closely because all these things start to make sense when you look at them in these subsets. So in that 10-year period, you can see some interesting growth was primarily below the 90-meter category. But the numbers, again, are still very small in the 60 to 90 category. It's only less than 200 boats in that number. But that's now changing quite dramatically. 2010 to 2020, you're seeing almost a doubling nearly of the 60 to 90 meter market. You're seeing a fairly significant growth in the 90 meter plus market. That's 6.1% per annum we're forecasting or we've seen happen within that sector. So you can see where these shifts are happening. There's a slowing down in the smaller categories because it's a much bigger number, obviously, but you're certainly seeing by 2020, this number at the bottom of the page there, growing to 5,700 by the end of this year. And that still may change because there's some fairly interesting delivery numbers that we need to discuss later. So here's our, let's say a sort of extrapolation forecast where we're taking similar growth numbers by category, by what's happening in the market, which gives us this potential 7,166 units by the end of 2030. So that number suddenly becomes quite interesting if we're looking at our market's potential in terms of after sales, refit, and the whole marina service sector. So these are numbers we look at. This 10-year period is fairly interesting as we look at the future of the marketplace. Okay, so we've broken down these categories we've just shown you into these delivery numbers and also the growth, the compensated aggregated growth rate. It shows some interesting curves there in comparison to the global fleet. These numbers, I think, are fairly indicative of where the market suddenly had its bubble in the late 2000s, before 2010 and after, around the crisis time. And we're now seeing this 2020 number. And that spike there is in there just for an anomaly identification. We're certainly seeing what's happened in the market where the projected deliveries for 2020 was one of the best years on record, projected. What's actually happening is not actually anywhere near what they were projecting due to the COVID crisis. We're seeing about 90 plus deliveries this year so far, and it may get a few more before the end of the year, but more importantly, the delay and lag of that market is going to push into 21, 22, 23, and we'll start showing those numbers at the end of this year when we do our annual report. What I've also put into context is the Italian marketplace linked to the global fleet. You can see there the dominant position the Italian fleet takes within this sector, certainly in terms of the number of deliveries within the 30 to 45 meter category. We know who the actors are: the Ferretti Group, Azimut Benetti Group, Overmarine, all these players who've got what they call very stable San Lorenzo type semi-custom production boats, which I think is a very interesting sector that we have to really look at from that wealth number earlier on. So we go into the larger fleet, 45 to 60 meters, and again, you can see very clearly how the market's moving and growing in the last 10 to 15 years. These numbers are fairly obvious that it's primarily driven by capacity of the yards that are operating in the sector, how many build slots, etc. So it stays around that 25 mark on a fairly consistent level if you take an average of the last 10, 15 years. But again, Italy's become a dominant player, and I think that's one thing we have to reinforce. Italy has become, and primarily has always been, apart from when the US was strong, the most powerful player in the marketplace, where it's the heart of superyachting, I call it almost, this passion, this production capacity. And then obviously on top of that, all the various infrastructure that goes with that makes Italy probably the most important country in the sector. I know a lot of people would challenge that in Northern Europe, but from my point of view, Italy's become the most important player. And we can see that they've enjoyed some incredible positioning in all the developing markets around the world, especially in the US. Taking the 60 to 90 meter market, you can see again, that's a very clear distinction from the first decade of this 30 years all the way into what we're having seen now, this fairly consistent flow of deliveries within this large super category. And the same applies. Italy's moving into the space now and getting more and more dynamic in their performance. But if we go into the 90 meter category, obviously the axis has changed. You've got between 4 and 10 deliveries there as the axis on the right. And what this means is that you're seeing some very anomalous builds pre-2005, where there's one-off projects coming, but now we have a fairly consistent market moving forward and some fairly exciting projects on the horizon. And when you talk to the lawyers, designers, brokers, and most of the big shipyards, there's still some interesting activity in this space, which is worth looking at more closely later on in other reports we're doing. And only in the last few years has Italy started to play in this space. We saw some very early stage projects in the 1990s, but one-offs basically. We're now moving into this fairly dominant space in Holland and Germany that Italy are now playing in the last probably 5 years. They've done some fairly interesting projects. And I feel there's an opportunity there that the fleet of 90 meter plus will move into different sectors and different shipyards across the landscape. The choice is certainly growing across the market. Talking about sailing boat very quickly, the sailing yacht fleet has had a very interesting history that we all know about, and we're seeing a very sort of decline marketplace in the last 5 years, and it hasn't really changed dramatically. There's still 4 or 5 key players. We wait to see what the Perini Navi future looks like, and obviously you've got some players up in Scandinavia who've really played a key role in this development of the 30 meter plus category in sailing yachts. Again, you see there that the dominance Italy played all the way through until probably 2015, 2014. And now there's a sort of opportunity that's arriving to reinvigorate the sailing market, purely because I feel there's the message of this being the greenest form of yachting on the planet. And I hope that we can get some sort of language out there about the future of sailing yachts being the right way to go in certain categories of yacht. So it's an interesting topic to explore in the green debate and other conversations over the next 2 days. So here's the future forecast in terms of how we see it, in terms of all the different segments of the market and their growth forecast through to 2030. And I think these numbers suddenly stack up as being a very interesting future for exactly the after sales and refit sector. So these numbers suddenly become very interesting if you have a refit yard, or more importantly, you're part of that infrastructure and the supply chain. Now, this is an interesting slide that just qualifies and validates some of the data anomalies we've seen in the last 20 years. You can see in 2005, 2009, 2010, 2014, this absolute plethora of players, 248 shipyards in our boom year were building 1 or 2 yachts that created these boom times that were exactly unstable times because there was fake finance, let's call it, and people building yachts as one-offs that just disappeared off the landscape. We've now consolidated down to this nice number of 108 shipyards who are what they call the real active shipyards in the sector. And that's probably a good thing for the market, to have much more stability, much more, I say, concentrated shipyards who are now building the active fleet. And more importantly, that number even reduces further to what I call the core 20 or 30 players who are really delivering the majority of the marketplace. And I think that's something we have to look at in terms of how the market has consolidated and matured in a way and become a much more, let's say, professional business, in terms of rather having lots of one-off players who think they can make some money out of building one boat and then disappearing either in bankruptcy or leaving a yacht without any sort of after-sales support. So these are interesting numbers that we look at very closely. Who's really still in the market today from the pre-2000 numbers is a good indication of stability and, let's say, professionalism in the marketplace. And all those numbers we've just put forward show you exactly what we call the potential, the true potential in this sort of what I call refit and after sales marketplace. These numbers represent the people who are primarily, based on our research, going into significant or real shipyard time on an annual basis based on survey anniversaries or better planned timetables for refit projects. Obviously, amongst all this data, there's a whole other dynamic in terms of maintenance and sort of, let's say, the service contracts that can happen on a very sort of private basis in marinas, or aren't really worth counting in what I call the pure refit data, where a shipyard isn't included in the process. It may be just renting space or doing what I call very simple maintenance work, managed by the captain or managed by the management company. So we're seeing a fairly interesting trend of much more activity in the shipyard market. And obviously, we've seen so much infrastructure investment in the last sort of 5 to 10 years to almost manage and, let's say, service what is going to be, let's say, a long-term future requirement, because these yachts are bigger, more complex, and actually require so much more, we call it sort of pre-planning before the yards are out of capacity, because obviously when you look at these numbers, the number of slots in some of the shipyards do not cope with what the potential really is. And I think where the infrastructure has been invested in the last 5 years, we're now ready, I think, for the larger fleet. But I look at that smaller fleet between 40 and 60 meters and 30 and 40 meters, it's an interesting potential there that suddenly becomes the real growth of the marketplace above 40 meters, which is something we look at very closely. They're the ones who really need the big refits or the more expensive refits. Between 30 and 40 meters, a lot of service companies, a lot of support from the manufacturer, which changes the dynamic there a little bit. So these numbers are very interesting for the larger fleet, which I think is where we really all focus in with a YARE conversation and all the debating we're doing in the next 2 days. So the next 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about certain things that I feel are worth exploring from the industry's point of view and from the captains and managers' point of view. Look at this refit after sales market and ask the question, what can be improved? And it becomes a very important debate later on in the next couple of days with planning. And the word planning is something that I hear far too often as being either last minute, insufficient, or perhaps putting your finger in the air and hoping that the wind is blowing in the right direction at the time you arrive in the shipyard. I talked to a few insurance companies the other day that were saying that sometimes a yacht will arrive at a shipyard or wait for a contract to be signed before they call the insurance company to say, I'm actually in a yard period now. We've got to get this industry to a stage where planning, organization, and preparation is much more seamless and becomes part of a life cycle of every single yacht in the fleet. There's 2 reasons for that. It reduces the surprises for the client, for the owner, and more importantly, it allows the shipyards and the infrastructure and the supply chain to plan their business models much more effectively. And I feel by having this maturing of the refit and after sales market, we can do a much better job of actually servicing the fleet. And it's a very well-known factor that planning is the fundamental part, but you still hear stories where plans are made last minute, and that really has to stop in this industry, which is a very complex, very demanding space where shipyards are expected to work miracles with very little notice or very little tendering documents, or even the idea of being able to understand the differences between certain shipyard bids and certain shipyards' capacity or capability. So it's about doing much more homework, much more planning, and making sure you arrive at a shipyard with everyone understanding exactly what is going on and what needs to be done by when. Planning, planning, planning. This is another topic I'd like to talk about. We saw the very interesting arrival of San Lorenzo on the stock exchange. I think one of the positives of this flotation, apart from the financial stability it gives to a company, I think one of the things that's very important here is you're looking at when people get floated on the stock exchange, especially a company like San Lorenzo, it raises the profile of our industry. It raises the profile of our marketplace to either investors or to private individuals in the way that people turn around and say, hey, what is this yacht market? We need to know more. We need to understand more. And who is dialed into the stock market? But all those interesting, wealthy people who are in that first phase of our presentation. So the more visible we become on the investment market, the more chances we have of building stability and liquidity in our industry. And I think that's another key factor. We can't have companies run with very weak liquidity, poor, let's say, balance sheets, but more importantly, having private investors who are bailing out companies. This, to me, is where we can really grow our industry and get much more interest from the wider world and obviously those high net worths that are always looking at the markets. So that's a key factor that we have to look at as an industry. This is an interesting topic because people talk about the cost of ownership and the value of ownership quite a lot. So I've got a few WhatsApp messages. Bear with me 1 second. I'm hoping people can hear me okay. The most important thing here is that we need to identify the total cost of ownership much more clearly before someone comes into the market, so they have no surprises. We have to identify exactly what it costs to run a boat before they jump into the marketplace, because this is where the owners can get frustrated or lose interest or feel that it's not adding value. And the word value is so important. What is the value of ownership? It's not an investment like a property investment. It's not a company investment. It's an investment in your lifestyle. So therefore, we have to make sure the value of ownership is never questioned, because the enjoyment factor for this cost element is so in sync and so balanced that the client thinks, I love my yacht. It's wonderful. It gives me so much pleasure and my family so much pleasure. So we have to make sure cost is transparent and he doesn't feel, or she doesn't feel, there is a hidden extra all the time. So that cost of ownership is something we really need to look at. And one of the sessions about managing expectations will really come into its own in terms of what is the value of ownership. We've got a session on the green, how green can we be? And again, sustainability is the global topic today. Every other industry is focused on sustainability. We're doing stuff as an industry. We are doing hybrid projects. We're delivering messages to the industry and to the wider world that we're building greener yachts. But we can do so much more at every single level of our supply chain, our manufacturing process, almost to say that yachts are leading the change and driving innovation in sustainability. So the perception of yachts is changing. We have to make that become an acceptable element, because the next generation, that huge number of people who will inherit those trillions of dollars, will suddenly think actually yachting does make sense and suddenly has something that's of interest to me, because that is the next generation's focus. This is another topic I like to talk about, the succession plan. And I think this is more from an industrial perspective. The people at the top of our industry are entering what I call their, let's call them their twilight years, being very, very candid. Maybe 5-10 years time, many of our patriarchs and matriarchs at the top of our industry may retire or leave this planet. Therefore, we have to make sure the right people are in the right place to lead for the future and inherit an industry that's stable and successful. And the succession planning isn't always easy with such a nuanced niche industry. We've seen examples of people coming into industry and running large organizations and not really understanding the dynamics of it or being able to adapt to what is a very unique space. But as we mature and grow into a much smarter industry, the next generation of leaders will hopefully understand that we have to change with some of the things I've already mentioned about manufacturing processes maybe, or the sales process, targeting the next generation. So the succession plan is a key thing we have to look at of who will be part of our future as leaders and industry figureheads. So it's an interesting time for this transition in the next 10 years before 2030. And no matter how many captains or how many managers are on this call at the moment watching this YARE 2020 10th edition, this is a big issue that I think we're all going to face. If we suddenly see growth in our market for the next 10 years, which I hope we'll see by being smarter with our approach to the new clients, the next generation, we need a lot of new people. We need a lot of people who really are passionate, the artisans, the experts, but also people who can project manage, people who can operate and drive and service the clients. Think about it. Another 2,000 yachts or whatever number ends up between now and 2030, we need to make sure we have those 50,000 crew that can be part of this next generation. We need to make sure we have a whole raft of apprentices and new people to run and support these industries at every manufacturing and service level. It's a fairly key part of our future stability, is the human capital. I know that Navigo and various other organizations are working hard on this, but ultimately what we're looking at is identifying the requirements and building a structure and strategy to make sure that capital, that human capital and the investment capital is aligned for the future. I go back to the next generation. Yachting may never become the cruising around the south of France, the Capri, the Porto Cervo at anchor in beautiful locations in the future. We may end up with a whole new group of people who think actually yachting is about this discovery of doing something different, something adventurous, something off the beaten track. It's been well talked about in the last 10 years, but we have to make sure yachting suddenly becomes attractive, not just because of the amount of sun pads or dining spaces, but is there something else that is going to excite the next generation as a new platform for fun? And I think this is a thing that is a fundamental in yachting, that how much fun can you have with the yacht becomes part of the next style or design element of making yachting attractive, this purpose. And I don't just mean these yachts for saving the planet with research, because that's a fantastic opportunity for certain people who are passionate about that. But there are other things. Yachting is still a leisure pastime. But sitting on a boat, sunbathing or drinking or chatting with friends is one era of yachting. But when we start to look at the people in Silicon Valley and the next generation of tech billionaires or new money in the inheritance world, are we relevant to the lives they lead? Are we really interesting based on some of the dynamics of yachting with the fuel consumption and various other elements that yachting suddenly becomes it's not a dirty word, but it becomes this language of purpose. And I think people want to have purpose in their assets and their fun factor to make sure they can tell their friends how much fun they're having and where they've been and what they've done with their yacht. These things become a key factor in the future of our marketplace. So the final slide I've just got is that if you look at the 4 or 5 slides I just talked about, and the early slide at the beginning of the presentation, we have incredible potential with a number of people who could afford to play in our market. But we are selling 120, 130 new boats a year between 30 meters and above. On the second-hand brokerage market, we're selling 2 to 240 boats per annum on average within the brokerage network. And to me, that is fairly weak penetration of a massive potential marketplace of high net worth, ultra high net worth, and billionaire category. So we have to look at this potential. And as we all know, how do we encourage them to see yachting as part of their lifestyle? And that capitalizing thing is a key factor. And I feel that's one of the messages I want to get across is this stability, this organizational structure, this service organization, making sure that when you buy into yachting, every layer of the journey is well organized, is great in terms of its service level, and is perfect in terms of its financial transparency. Because once we get to a stage where clients say, absolutely, yachting is fantastic, it is the best industry to be involved in, every layer of the journey is fun, the people are great, the investment is actually paying huge dividends of the value for my family, and more importantly, I want to keep doing it for the rest of my life because it's just the best escape bubble in what is a very, very unique year. And I feel this potential is almost been accelerated by COVID-19 and the pandemic. We've seen in Asia, we've seen in America, and we've seen across the landscape some interesting sales figures that suddenly suggest that the ultra high net worth client base is woken up to that yachting is a very unique private escape bubble and a safe haven in this crazy world we now live in. So I feel that we've got this potential. We have to now use the next 3 years, maybe 5 years, to really focus in on some strategic ideas for change so we can build a very strong future for 2030 and beyond. And I feel from that point of view, we have an interesting opportunity as an industry to drive a long-term success plan with the right people at the top of the pile and all the people feeding the industry in terms of next generation employees, next generation crew, so that the actual operational side becomes even more seamless. I think on that note, I wish you all a wonderful couple of days of YARE. There's some interesting stuff being discussed, and I'm sure all those with the app and all those participating, please have your say and please share your views. This is going to be a fun couple of days. Then after these 2 days, we have all the face-to-face conversations and private meetings in early December. And I really can't wait to be back in Viareggio next year. And I wish you a good few days. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. I think if anyone has any questions, we have oh, hang on. We've got some questions popping up straight away. Oh, can anyone, was the audio bad? Did anyone hear me okay? Please just raise your hands if you heard me okay. Yes, thank you. Some of you did. Brilliant. Thank you. Sorry if it was bad in the beginning, but I mean, I can control that. If I was there, you'd hear me. I promise. I promise. Okay. Questions? Anyone? Please fire away. Fire away. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you, and I believe that we now have got to go to some music as the next stage of the YARE. Stay with me, stay enjoying the day, and I will see you later on today for the Passerelle pitch. And there's some really good stuff happening the rest of the day with some good yard tours and other stuff. So please don't miss it.